The medieval period in English literature extends for more than 800 years. From Cædmon's hymn at the end of the 7th century to Everyman at the end of the 15th. Historians used to divide this period into two parts, calling the earlier centuries the Dark Ages in order to distinguish their quality from that of the later centuries, when European culture attained one of the summits of its history. Though this distinction is misleading, for the Dark Ages were only relatively dark. It is nevertheless true that the English Middle Ages embraced two quite different periods of literary history: the Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, and the Middle English, sharply divided from each other by the Norman Duke William's conquest of the island in 1066. Both English culture and the English language changed radically in the years following this event, and English literature was given a new spirit. Because it is impossible to read the Old English language without a great deal of study, Old English texts printed in this book are given in translation. Middle English texts such as Chaucer's, written in a dialect which is the ancestor of modern Standard English, appear in the original, but have been spelled in a way that it is hoped will aid the reader. Middle English texts written in the more difficult regional dialects are given in translation. Analyses of the sounds and grammar of Middle English, and of Old and Middle English prosody, appear at the end of this introduction. The Anglo-Saxons and the heroic ideal. The Anglo-Saxon invasion of the island of Britain, which began in the first half of the 5th century, was a phase of a great folk migration that had started some centuries earlier and was to continue for several more, the movement of the Germanic tribes from the northeast of Europe into the areas of the Roman Empire, to the west, south, and southeast. The so-called Anglo-Saxon invaders of Britain actually consisted of three tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, although each was independent. Through their common Germanic heritage, these tribes were closely allied with one another and with the many other tribes that already had or would in the future overrun much of the old Roman Empire. They shared the same prehistoric ancestors. Even in historical times, their individual tongues amounted to little other than variant dialects of a common language, while the customs of one tribe differed little from those of another. In its earliest period, Germanic society had been organized by families. The head of the family was the chief of his close kinsmen, and the family formed an independent political entity. With the passing of time, the unit of society tended to grow larger as a number of families united under a single superior chieftain or king, to use the word derived from the old Germanic name for chief. But the unit grew to be very large only rarely, when some particularly successful king attracted others to him in order to perform some specific exploit. And such larger unions rarely endured long after the completion of the venture for which they had been formed. The normal order of society was made up of a number of small bands, which, while they did not always live at peace with one another, still shared a sense of community and kinship, especially in the face of a common enemy such as the people whose lands they were invading. But when they had conquered, their natural political divisiveness reasserted itself. Thus, long after the Anglo-Saxons had become settled in Britain, the island was still broken up into a bewildering number of kingdoms, some of them very short-lived, and a coherent union of all Englishmen was not achieved until after the Norman conquest. The same general organization of many kings coexisting within a common culture had been characteristic of that other migratory people. The Greeks, or, more accurately, Achaeans, who centuries earlier had overrun the region of the eastern Mediterranean, and both to the Achaeans and to the Germanic peoples, the ideal of kingly behavior was enormously important. Indeed, it was perhaps the chief spiritual force behind the civilizations they both developed. The creative power that, in their earliest periods, shaped their history and their literature. It is generally called the heroic ideal. And put most simply, the heroic ideal was excellence. The hero king strove to do better than anyone else the things that an essentially migratory life demanded: to sail a ship through a storm, to swim a river or a bay, to tame a horse, to choose a campsite and set firm defenses. In times of peace, even to plow a field or build a hole. But always and above all, to fight. Skill and courage were the primary qualities of a king who should successfully lead his people in battle and sustain him during peace. In its oldest form, the ideal was appropriate only to kings. But because society was so closely knit, all the more important male members of the tribe tended to imitate it. Germanic society was wholly dominated by males. Women are rarely mentioned in the surviving records of it, and only if they are the wives or daughters of kings. In general, of course, the heroic ideal of conduct was aristocratic, restricted to the king and his immediate retainers, though without that quality of unreality and remoteness from daily life that we associate with later medieval aristocracy. The king was the active leader of a small number of fellow warriors who, as members of his household, beheld all that he did. A successful king won from his retainers complete loyalty. It was their duty to defend him in battle, to give up their own lives while defending or avenging his. In return, the king gave his retainers gifts from the spoil that had been accumulated in warfare. Royal generosity was one of the most important aspects of heroic behavior, for it symbolized the excellence of the king's rule, implying on the one hand that the retainers deserved what they were given because of their loyalty to him, and, on the other, showing that he himself was worthy of such loyalty. The heroic ideal had a very practical bearing on the life of the people whom the king ruled. While the heroic ideal would win practical success for a king, it had also another, perhaps more important end: enduring fame. In cultures whose religion, unlike Christianity, offers no promise of an afterlife, a name that will live on after one's death serves as the closest substitute for immortality. From this arises the heroic paradox, still latent in our own civilization, that by dying gloriously one may achieve immortality. The poet who could sing the story of his heroic life was, of course, the agent upon whom the hero depended for his fame, and a good poet, or bard, to use the customary term for the poet of heroic life, was a valued member of a primitive court. Alexander is said to have expressed envy of Achilles because he had had a Homer to celebrate his deeds. The poetic form which primitive bards evolved for their heroic narratives is called epic. It is characterized by a solemn dignity of tone and elevation of style. Their poems were not written down, but recited aloud from memory, and hence most of them have been lost. In Greek, there have survived Homer's two epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, while from Germanic culture the chief survivor is the Old English Beowulf. But enough has been preserved to show the enduring popularity of heroic stories throughout the migratory phase of the two peoples, who never tired of hearing the deeds of their folk heroes. Thus the immortality that the old heroes had sought was achieved through poetry, and poetry in turn gave inspiration to later men in leading their own lives. Christianity and Old English culture. Whatever literary materials the Anglo-Saxons brought with them when they came to Britain existed only in their memories, for the making of written records was something they learned only when they were converted to Christianity. The Celtic inhabitants whose land they were seizing were Christians, as had been the Romans whose forces had occupied the island since the 1st century and whose withdrawal at the beginning of the 5th had opened the way to the Anglo-Saxons. But for 150 years after the beginning of the invasion, Christianity was maintained only in the remoter regions where the Anglo-Saxons failed to penetrate. In the year 597, however, Augustine was sent by Pope Gregory as a missionary to King Ethelbert of Kent, one of the most southerly of the kingdoms into which England was divided. And about the same time, missionaries from Ireland began to preach Christianity in the north. Within 75 years, the island was once more predominantly Christian. Ethelbert himself was one of the first Englishmen to be converted, and it is indicative of the relationship between Christianity and writing that the first written specimen of the Old English, Anglo-Saxon, language is a code of laws promulgated by the first English Christian king. In the centuries that followed, up until the Norman conquest, England produced a large number of distinguished, highly literate churchmen. One of the earliest of these was Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people, written in Latin, was completed in 731. This remains our most important source of knowledge about the Anglo-Saxon period. In the next generation, Alcuin, a man of wide culture, became the friend and advisor of the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, whom he assisted in making the Frankish court a great center of learning. Thus, by the year 800, English culture had developed so richly that it overflowed its insular boundaries. But the greatest impetus on English culture came from a man who was not of the clergy. Alfred, king of the West Saxons from 871 to 899, who for a time united all the kingdoms of southern England and beat off those new Germanic invaders, the Vikings. This most active king was an enthusiastic patron of literature. He himself translated various works from Latin, the most important of which was Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, the early 6th century Roman work whose heroic stoicism has proved continually congenial to the English temperament. Apparently under Alfred's direction, Bede's history was also translated into Old English, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was begun. This year-by-year record of important events in England was maintained until the middle of the 12th century. Furthermore, the preservation of many of the surviving earlier English works, including Beowulf, is due to the fact that copies of them were made in the West Saxon dialect because, in large part, of the impetus Alfred gave to literary studies, though the political stability that Alfred achieved was not long-lived. The culture he nourished so lovingly was maintained at a high level until the very end of the Old English period. Old English poetry. The genius for heroic poetry the Anglo-Saxons brought with them when they came to Britain, as they probably also brought with them the alliterative form. See the section on Old and Middle English prosody, in which all the Old English poetry that has survived was composed, since they wrote nothing down until they had become Christianized, and since in many respects Christian ideals and heroic ideals are antipathetic. It is natural that very little poetry has survived that is surely pre-Christian in composition. But much of Beowulf, the greatest of Germanic epics, is evidently pre-Christian, even though the author of the particular form of the poem that has come down to us was a Christian who refers to events of the Old, but not of the New Testament. Several other short pieces or fragments also seem to reflect the pagan period without Christian coloring. Yet the vast bulk of Old English poetry is specifically Christian, devoted to religious subjects. Interestingly enough, however, it is almost all in the heroic mode, while the Anglo-Saxons adapted themselves readily to the ideals of Christianity. They did not do so without adapting Christianity to their own heroic ideal, in order to make the alien world of the Bible intelligible to their people. They endued its characters and stories with many of the values that they had inherited from their pagan ancestors. Thus Moses and Saint Andrew, Christ and God the Father share the attributes of a Beowulf, are represented as heroes who performed famous deeds. In the Dream of the Rood, the cross speaks of Christ as the young hero, strong and stout-hearted, whose crucifixion is less a passion than an heroic action. In Caedmon's hymn, the creation of heaven and earth is seen as a mighty deed, an establishment of wonders, not altogether unlike Hrothgar's building of the Hall Horret in Beowulf. The sad consciousness of the transience of all earthly good combined with the compulsion to go on striving, so characteristic of the heroic spirit, appears most poignantly in two Christian laments, the Wanderer and the Seafarer. That the heroic ideal held its value down to the end of the Old English period is shown by the Battle of Maldon, in which the defeat of English defenders by a band of marauding Vikings is described in the highest tradition of Germanic heroism. Against doom, there is only courage. The world of Old English poetry is a dark one, and to a modern reader, it may also seem a narrow one with narrow laws that exclude all but sardonic laughter. Men in the mead hall are said to be cheerful, but even there they think of struggle in war, of possible triumph but more possible failure. Romantic love, one of the principal topics of later literature, appears hardly at all. Men seem seldom to relax. Clothed in their armor, they are always preparing to test their courage against fate. They are, indeed, so habitually seen as warriors that in the earlier poetry the words for man and warrior are often interchangeable. Depressing as this world may seem, It is recreated in Old English poetry with extraordinary intensity, with high spiritual excitement. This excitement is achieved in part by the frequent use of ironic understatement. Actions and things are spoken of as less than they really are because, apparently, the speaker wishes to suggest that they are more, or perhaps other, than they are. They cared not for battle, says the author of the Battle of Maldon about those cowardly Englishmen who fled the fight. Even the kenning, that highly formalized compound metaphor common to old Germanic poetry, often seems to suggest potentials ironically, Wales Road, or Swan's Path, for a sea so perilous for men lacking the physical equipment of whales and swans. The dignity the Anglo-Saxons assigned to poetry, which was the repository of the ancient traditions by which they lived, apparently prevented the humor latent in ironic understatement from reaching any expression more overt than a grim smile. Yet despite its somberness, Old English poetry goes about its business of depicting harsh reality with extraordinary subtlety and intensity. The Norman Conquest and its effects. In the year 1066, England was once more invaded and conquered by a Germanic people, though one whose culture was widely different from the Anglo-Saxons. The Normans, the name is actually a form of Norsemen, were the descendants of Scandinavian adventurers who, at the beginning of the 10th century, had seized a wide part of northern France. A highly adaptable nation, they had adopted the language of the land they had settled in and had set up a powerful state, while its ruler was technically a duke subject to the King of France. Normandy was actually an independent political entity. The invasion of England was led by the energetic Duke William. The English were divided and irresolute. At the decisive Battle of Hastings, they were defeated by the Normans, and their leader, Harold, was killed. Thereafter, William's forces overran much of England, and the Norman Duke became its king and ensured the succession to his descendants. But, kings of England though they were, he and his followers were not as much interested in the country he had won, though they were constantly fighting the Welsh, the Scots, and their own barons for control of parts or the whole of it, as they were in their continental possessions. The first 7 English kings were mostly absentee rulers, and their presence within the kingdom was seldom less troublesome for it than their absence from it. It was not, indeed, until the 13th century, with the reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, that England became the principal concern of its kings. And it was not until the very end of the Middle Ages that English monarchs finally gave up trying to make good their continental claims and became, perforce, purely English. The immediate effect of the Norman conquest upon English literature was to remove it from the care of the aristocracy, the spiritual if not actual descendants of the Anglo-Saxon kings and their retainers, and to deprive it of that cohesive spirit that it had previously possessed. The great aristocratic households, which were the centers of pre-conquest cultural activity, were broken up or parceled out to the conqueror's Norman barons, and the English aristocracy was either displaced or forced into service with the invaders. For a considerable time, even the English language seems to have fallen into disuse as a vehicle for written literature. For very little survives of English between the conquest and the year 1200. Initially, men of education who continued to produce literary works wrote either in Latin or in Anglo-Norman, the dialect of French that was spoken by the new rulers of England. But since the practical Normans were less preoccupied with culture than the English, the literature in Anglo-Norman was not very distinguished and was not very long enduring, hardly surviving the reign of Edward I, 1272 to 1307. Latin, which had always been and continued to be the language of the international church, produced a fairly rich literature in England during this period, especially in the 12th century. But throughout the Middle Ages, Latin literature remained essentially conservative and remote, not much dealing with the subjects that are of importance in the development of vernacular literature. Thus, for more than a century, the twin snobberies, social on the part of Anglo-Norman, intellectual on the part of Latin, probably preempted the energies of educated men who might at an earlier or a later time have written in English. But even if the educated were writing literature in other languages, the uneducated were undoubtedly continuing to compose, if not to write, in English. When written English literature begins to reappear at the end of the 12th century, the larger part of it carries the stamp of popular or at least semi-popular origin. Indeed, considered in its bulk, Middle English literature is a popular literature. Its origin in the orders of society below the top provides its most striking contrast with Old English literature. Most of the latter seems to be uttered by a single aristocratic voice. Grave, decorous, responsible, speaking in terms of high communal aspirations. Middle English literature, on the other hand, is uttered by a medley of different voices, dealing with a wide range of topics in a great diversity of styles and tones and genres. Originality of thought, to be sure, is a rare feature of this literature, for no matter how diverse the voices may be, they often seem to be saying precisely the same things as each other. Yet Middle English literature has virtues not found in Old English. Because its writers addressed themselves to a popular audience, they achieved a greater immediacy, a greater recognizability. A modern reader experiences little difficulty in understanding the world they are talking about. The change is perhaps most obvious in the narrative of adventure, where the idealized hero of Old English yields place to the more sympathetic if less admirable man who not only fights and fights again but also laughs and cries, plays games, and, above all, falls in and out of love. The non-aristocratic man was the readier to supplant the epic hero because a mature Christianity places as much value on a plain man's soul as it does on an epic hero's. In dealing with this new kind of hero, the writer's imaginative perspective was broadened as much, perhaps, as his ability to see deeply was decreased. And the fact is that not only in specifically moral and doctrinal literature, whose premises are timeless, but also in ephemeral literature designed merely to provide entertainment, one senses this unchangingness. A romance written at the beginning of the 13th century differs little from one written in the 15th, with which it shares its plot. And at the very end of the period Malory is still peopling with his knights a never-never land of chivalry that had its origin in 12th century France. It is clear enough that between 1066 and 1485, England underwent large political and social changes in the developments in feudalism, the gradual evolution of Parliament, the growth of cities and of the middle class along with the increase in foreign trade, and in many other similar phenomena. But apparently the changes occurred too slowly to produce much intellectual awareness of them on the part of writers. The great exception to this and to all other generalizations is Chaucer, whose pages are informed, especially in his handling of the bourgeois, by an excited sense of the novelty of social life in his own times. Langland's Piers Plowman also possesses something of this quality, though without Chaucer's tone of approval. But in an age where most people were born in the same village where their grandparents had been born and lived virtually the same lives, doing the same work with the same tools, enjoying the same sports and the same festivals, large slow-moving change is probably bound to be imperceptible to all but the most acute observers, imperceptible and, if perceived, disapproved. But if in a broad historical sense change was imperceptible, in the daily lives of medieval men it was all too visible. Indeed, the inevitability of change for the worse, even in the lives of people already apparently wholly wretched, is one of the most insistently repetitive themes of Middle English literature. Nor is this theme to be thought of merely as another expression of the world-hating doctrine. Rather, the theme and the world-hating doctrine itself are both results of the violence of life in the Middle Ages, a violence not matched again in Western history until our own times. Famine, war, pestilence, and death, these are the riders who passed through the streets of medieval cities and villages by night and by day. The fact that 8 of the 18 kings who ruled England between 1066 and 1485 died deaths of violence or deaths resulting from violent activity is characteristic of the times. Men hardly less august were also constantly meeting death in battles, or by murder, or by accident, or, not infrequently, on the scaffold before a fascinated populace. The chroniclers who record these events say little of the lower orders of society, but constant warfare against enemies at home and abroad, the depredations of the powerful in supplying themselves from the fruits of the toil of the poor, the fearful severity of the laws combined with the failure to enforce them against the strong, and, especially after the middle of the 14th century, recurrent pestilence compounded by famine. All these explain why change for the worse seems to have been the unchanging expectation of medieval people, and, even in the temporary absence of these events, the coldness and darkness of an English winter for people living in badly insulated dwellings with only minimal heat and light might well seem to make life a bleak perpetual twilight. In view of the violence prevalent during most of the period, it is perhaps extraordinary that so much literature was produced. But even in the worst of times, things are not always and everywhere at their worst. Spring does come, and some people get through life almost untouched by disasters that seem historically to be omnipresent. And the fact is that, except in its most ruthlessly world-hating forms, Middle English literature is often permeated by a curious normality, and is, indeed, less preoccupied with its age's violence than we are with ours. Probably because people then never conceived of a time when violence was not a fact of life. Despite being constantly warned to expect change for the worse, people in the Middle Ages seem, in their daily lives, to have pursued the same pleasures that we pursue today, pursued them with rather more relish because they were rarer. This is clear from the accounts both of those who approved of the pursuit and of those who did not. As the general atmosphere of violence suggests, medieval society was in some ways more primitive than our own, or more frankly primitive, and made us seem to us more childlike. People took tremendous pleasure in color, in dress, in ritual, in parades, in spectacles, in elaborate food and drink, when they could get them, in all those aspects of life that children especially love, and most adults do not scorn. Like children, medieval people were subject to emotional extremes. They wept more quickly than we do, went more quickly from weeping to laughter and back again, were headstrong and hasty, quick to sin zestily and to repent heartily, and then to sin and repent again. Yet it is a mistake to overemphasize this childishness. Their life was physically more limited than ours. Without our comforts, our mobility, our communications, it was even more precarious, more uncertain. But as it is reflected in the best writers, they lived their life very richly and perhaps with greater awareness and greater savor than we do ours. Middle English literature. It has been said earlier that from the century and a half after the conquest very little English literature has survived. And it is probable that in that period very little was written. But that literature was still being composed, if not written down, during the period is suggested by the first considerable Middle English poem to have come down to us. This is Layamon's Brut, written about 1205 in an alliterative prosody that is clearly directly descended from the Old English poetic measure, though the subtleties of the older measure have disappeared. Apparently, at least for oral purposes, alliterative poetry never ceased to be composed, as is further suggested by its reappearance later in written form in the so-called alliterative revival of the 14th century, which culminated in Piers Plowman and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Layamon's Brut is also interesting because it contains the first treatment in English of the Arthurian legend, the story that was to catch the imagination of so many English writers of later times. Layamon's source was a Norman work by the poet Wache, which was in turn based on the Englishman Geoffrey of Monmouth's Latin History of the Kings of Britain. According to the old tradition, England had been founded by one Brutus, who was a descendant of the Trojan Aeneas, the founder of Rome, and after whom Britain was named, hence the title Brut. Of Brutus' descendants, the most distinguished was Arthur, who according to the legend freed Britain from the Roman yoke and successfully defended it from the Anglo-Saxon invaders. It is a double curiosity about the Arthurian legend that not only did the British, Celtic, Arthur become in later centuries the great legendary hero of Englishmen whose ancestors he was presumably successful in beating off the island, but also that the Arthurian legend itself reached its fullest development in France, whither it may have been brought by Celts crossing the Channel to Brittany, some of them perhaps fleeing from the Anglo-Saxons. In any case, after Geoffrey and Layamon, England produced no original writers on Arthur as opposed to translators from the French until the poet of Gawain, whom some critics suspect of translating, and Malory also a translator, but on so grand a scale as to rank as truly original. Both Layamon and the poet of Beowulf dealt with legendary materials which they thought of as history. Layamon's treatment, however, is different from, and far less impressive than, the epic mode of Beowulf. It moves toward the genre, so characteristic of the later Middle Ages, known as romance. The romance has certain typical features. It generally concerns knights and involves a large amount of fighting as well as a number of miscellaneous adventures. It makes liberal use of the improbable, often of the supernatural. It is often, though not always, involved with romantic love. Characterization is standardized, so that heroes, heroines, and wicked stewards could easily move from one romance to another without causing any disturbance in the narrative. The plots generally consist of a great number of events, and the same event is apt to occur several times within the same romance. And the style is apt to be easy and colloquial, not infrequently loose and repetitious. Although it was enormously popular in medieval England, it makes up a large fraction of the total of preserved Middle English literature. Middle English romance is apt to disappoint the modern reader. Unfortunately, very few accomplished poets, the Gawain poet and Chaucer are two of the principal exceptions, turned their hand to romance. It was apparently left largely to minstrels and other uncultivated versifiers addressing a semi-literate audience, often in dog-trot verse full of windy clichés. The great age of medieval romance had been the 12th and early 13th centuries, and its chief breeding ground had been aristocratic society in France, where such poets as Chrétien de Troyes spun their marvelously sophisticated tales. The Middle English purveyors of romance, functioning before non-aristocratic audiences in the second half of the 13th and in the 14th century, introduced the French romances into English. The majority of the surviving English romances are either proved or suspected adaptations from the French. The result of the lag in time and change in audience is artistically unfortunate, though often unintentionally amusing. Aristocratic ideals of behavior of a different era and an alien society were replaced by patterns of behavior that could be easily comprehended by bourgeois and lower-class Englishmen. Heroes who have all the accoutrements of the most chivalrous of knights are apt to behave in the crudest fashion, whether they are fighting, eating, or making love. They act as a petty bourgeois might if suddenly given an opportunity to enjoy the high scale of living of chivalric aristocracy with no education in how such a life should be conducted. Nevertheless, it is often agreeable to watch the blunt Englishman who replaced the aristocratic hero react with practical common sense to the extravagant situations in which the poem has placed him. And there is one very charming exception to the rule that translation brings deterioration. Sir Orfeo, apparently based on a lost French poem recasting the classical legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, transmits much of that delicacy and magic which the reader who first approaches medieval romance expects to find in it. By far the larger proportion of surviving Middle English literature is religious, though it is not necessarily true that an equal amount composed in Middle English was religious. The Church had a virtual monopoly on literacy during much of the Middle Ages. For the average person who had learned to read and write probably had done so because he had signified his intention, not always fulfilled, of becoming a cleric, that is, an ecclesiast, performing one of the many functions of the Church. Otherwise, he would probably not have received any but the most elementary kind of education. Furthermore, the Church not only had this direct claim upon the services of the majority of literate men, but also was itself a large producer of books in the physical sense. Books were actually handwritten manuscripts, as well as a maintainer, especially in monasteries, of libraries. Therefore it is quite natural that religious literature should bulk large. But the literature that has been lost probably contained a very large number of secular items. Professional storytellers such as minstrels committed to memory tales that they had heard others recite or had composed themselves and did not trouble to write down, if, indeed, they could write. Their stories depended for survival on some literate hero, who thought them worth recording, and perhaps few clerics would take the trouble. And even secular literature that had been recorded might sometimes be lost because of the low esteem in which it was held by austere churchmen who would enforce St. Paul's precept that everything that is written ought to express specific Christian doctrine when library shelves became crowded. It was probably the secular works that were removed to make room for books more beneficial to the spirit. Unfortunately, good doctrine is not necessarily good literature, and the larger part of Middle English religious writing is literature at all only in the broadest sense of that word. Sermons, homilies, saints' lives, penitential tracts, manuals for priests, mystical writings, lyric poems, moral allegories, stories of miracles, all the possible genres of religious writing are represented profusely, though not in quality, richly. An occasional individual work distinguishes itself strikingly from the surrounding drabness, for instance, the very early Ancrine Re, or Rule for Anchoresses, Female Religious Recluses, or a late lyric like I Sing of a Maiden. But the brilliant exceptions are few and far between. Few minds were able to sustain originality amid the oppressive conventionality of doctrine and response to doctrine. And few educated people before the time of Chaucer seem to have had the temerity to venture into the secular. We are fortunate that the work of one such person, the author of The Early Owl and the Nightingale, has survived. For this humorous debate between birds is the most original and Chaucer-like poem before Chaucer himself. During the last quarter of the 14th century, Middle English literature flowered suddenly and inexplicably in three great poets, writing at almost the same time and giving supreme artistic expression to almost all the characteristic genres of Middle English. The author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight not only produced the best romance of the entire period, but also wrote some of its best religious poetry. His biblical narrative in alliterative verse, Patience, the story of Jonah, is rivaled only by certain Old English poems. In The Pearl he combined elegy with theology to produce the most moving religious poem, and the most finely wrought poem, of the English later Middle Ages. William Langland's achievement in Piers Place 01 Man is important both in literature and in history, since he faced squarely the great religious and social issues of his day, and these became the great issues of the following century and a half. Imitations of Piers Plowman, which borrow both Piers himself and Langland's anti-ecclesiastical satire, played an important part in bringing on the reformation of the Church which Langland prophesied but would have deplored. Needless to say, no imitator approaches Langland in the extraordinary originality of his weaving together of all sorts of genres of religious literature, from the most menacing sermon to the most dazzling lyric. Geoffrey Chaucer's achievement was greatest of all. The new perspective which English literature after the conquest had attained had revealed broader horizons. But they were too broad and too clouded with distractions to enable the average writer to bring everything into clear focus. It takes a powerfully disciplined mind to comprehend infinite variety in a single artistic vision. Such a mind was Chaucer's. While he was entirely rooted in the soil of the Middle Ages and tried his hand at a large number of medieval genres, his art is so fully realized as to carry him out of the Middle Ages and make him one of the 2 or 3 greatest poets in English. This sudden fluorescence in the Gawain poet, Langland, and Chaucer may have been partly due to patronage of literature by the well-to-do. Chaucer was a court poet who seems to have been encouraged not only by John of Gaunt, but perhaps also by Gaunt's father, Edward III, died 1377, as well as by his nephew Richard II, deposed 1399, and, in the last year of the poet's life, by Gaunt's son, Henry IV. The Gawain poet probably wrote for a provincial aristocratic court, remote from London but no less interested in literary art. Even William Langland seems to have enjoyed patronage, but from what source it is hard to be sure. It is probable that at one time or another he was sheltered by monasteries, and it is not unlikely that he ended his life in one. In any case, English literature is fortunate that these 3 great contemporary poets all found encouragement from one source or another. But patronage does not assure great poetry. Chaucer's friend, the poet John Gower, also enjoyed royal patronage. But he has not proved much of a threat to Chaucer's reputation. He seems a far more typically medieval writer than Chaucer. He wrote 3 works which, linguistically at least, summarized the English Middle Ages. 1 in Latin, 1 in Norman French, and 1, Confessio Amantis, the Lover's Confession, in English. Were it not for its proximity to Chaucer, this last would probably be rated somewhat higher than it has been. For it is a work of considerable skill and interest, and it is certainly infinitely superior to anything produced by the English poets of the next century, some of whom enjoyed patronage but all of whom seem, after Chaucer, to represent regression into the worst vices of medieval literature. The most Chaucerian of Chaucer's followers are, indeed, Scotsmen, and the best of them, Robert Henryson and William Dunbar, who often reflect Chaucer's satirical spirit and his liveliness, belong not to the medieval period but to the Renaissance. Yet if the 15th century in England lacks great names, Thomas Malory alone enjoys a high reputation as a literary artist. It is nevertheless a period in which popular literature flourished. Some of the best lyrics, religious and secular, date from this time, and this was also the century in which many of the ballads were composed. It was also the period of much activity in drama. The mystery plays, which had probably become established in the previous century, continued to be performed widely, and the cycles of these religious dramas that have been preserved from York, Chester, and Wakefield date from the 15th century. The same century saw the development of the morality play, culminating in Everyman. The authors of the plays, ballads, and lyrics of the century are nameless. Aside from the plays, manuscripts of which were kept only by the towns in which the performances were given, these anonymous works were probably transmitted orally and only haphazardly written down. Fortunately for the future history of English literature, Malory's Morte d'Arthur, written during its author's long sojourn in prison, did not have to depend on the chance survival of a manuscript. It was printed in 1485 by William Caxton, who had introduced printing by movable type to England less than 10 years earlier. Malory's is the last great medieval work of literature. Using mostly French sources, Malory put together a history of King Arthur and his knights which, while wholly fictional, has received much the same honor from later Englishmen that earlier Englishmen accorded Beowulf. Medieval English. The medieval works in this book were composed in 2 different states of our language. Old English, the language which took shape among the Germanic settlers of England and preserved its integrity until the Norman conquest radically altered English. Civilization, and Middle English, the earliest records of which date from the early 12th century and which gave way to modern English shortly after the introduction of printing at the end of the 15th century. Old English is a very heavily inflected language, that is, the words change form to indicate changes in usage, such as person, number, tense, case, mood, etc. Most languages have some inflection. For example, the personal pronouns in modern English have different forms when used as objects, but a heavily inflected language is one in which almost all classes of words undergo elaborate patterns of change. Its vocabulary is almost entirely Germanic. In Middle English, the inflectional system was weakened, and a large number of words were introduced into it from France, so that many of the older native words disappeared. Because of the difficulty of Old English, all selections from it in this book have been given in translation, in order that the reader may see an example of the language. Caedmon's hymn has been printed in the original, together with an interlinear translation. The present discussion, then, is concerned only with Middle English. The chief difficulty with Middle English for the modern reader is caused not by its inflections so much as by its spelling, which may be described as a rough and ready phonetic system, and by the fact that it is not a single standardized language, but consists of a number of regional dialects, each with its own peculiarities of sound and its own systems for representing sounds in writing. The Midland dialect, the dialect of London and of Chaucer, and the ancestor of our own standard speech, differs greatly from the dialect spoken in the west of England, the original dialect of Piers Plowman. and from that of the northwest, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and from that of the north, the second shepherd's play. And these dialects differ from one another. In this book, the long texts composed in the more difficult dialects have been translated or modernized, and those which, like Chaucer, Everyman, the lyrics, and the ballads, appear in the original, have been respelled in a way that it is hoped will aid the reader. The remarks which follow apply chiefly to Chaucer's Midland English, though certain non-Midland dialectal variations are noted if they occur in some of the other selections.